Who was drive? Pangloss?
The brilliant French satiric essayist François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire. 1694–1778, pilloried Leibniz's philosophical optimism with the character of Dr. Pangloss in his novel Candide. The character Candide is the illegitimate nephew of a baron who starts out life in luxury, with Dr. Pangloss as his teacher. Pan is Greek for all and gloss means tongue, speech, and words, so that Dr. Pangloss translates as Dr. Alltalk. Dr. Pangloss teaches the metaphysico-theologo-cosmology to Candide. This teaching is a caricature of Leibniz and the poet Alexander Pope's philosophical optimism, which Voltaire found very difficult to reconcile with real human suffering, such as the devastation caused by the 1755 Lisbon earthquake and the oppression of the Ancien regime in pre-revolutionary France. The view of philosophical optimism held that because God is good, everything in the world must be good, as well. It is, in fact, the best world it could be, and everything in it, including what appear as evil to us, is, in the grand scheme of things, inevitable and for the best. Here's a sample of Voltaire's satire in which Dr. Pangloss expresses his belief. It is demonstrable, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than as they are. For as all things have been created for some end, they must necessarily be created for the best end. Observe, for instance, the nose is formed for spectacles, therefore we wear spectacles. The legs are visibly designed for stockings, accordingly we wear stockings. Stones were made to be hewn and to construct castles, therefore my lord has a magnificent castle. For the greatest baron in the province ought to be the best lodged. Swine were intended to be eaten, therefore we eat pork all the year round, and they who assert that everything is right, do not express themselves correctly, they should say that everything is best.
How were 19th century German idealists different from Plato or George Berkeley?
Before the 19th century, idealism tended to be a train of thought in individual writers who posited the existence of unseen entities and claimed greater reality for them than the things in the world that could be sensed. Except for Plotinus, 205–270, and other Neoplatonists. Idealism before the 19th century was limited to positing entities or structures that existed in a separate realm, independently of perceived reality, as humans perceive reality. The 19th century idealists, in contrast, posited ideal entities and structures and also described their functions in ways that directly influenced the perceived world and events within it. A medical analogy is that before the 19th century, idealists were like philosophical anatomists, whereas in the 19th century, idealists also worked as philosophical physiologists. This last is especially true of Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, although he could not have constructed his system without Immanuel Kant's. 1724 to 1804, work before him, and the directions in which Johann Gottlieb Fichte. 1762 to 1814, and Friedrich Schelling, 1775 to 1854, tried to take Kant's work.
What have Western philosophers recognized in Buddhism?
Buddhist thought rejects ideas of substance or substances as entities that endure through time and change. Speculation about the eternity of the world, its infinity, or the connections between the soul or mind and the body are not considered worthwhile. In the Theravada schools of thought, perceptual experience is believed to justify mind-independent entities. But we do not experience them directly. Some commentators hold that there are independent entities. Otherwise our inference from experience that they exist could not be justified. Furthermore, we do not control what we perceive, which suggests that things exist outside of our perception. Others distinguish between reliable and unreliable sensory experience. Some Buddhists believe that both minds and bodies are collections of transitory perceptions. According to the Madhyamaka school, there can't be individual objects because everything is dependent on everything else. However, enlightenment can result in an awareness of an underlying reality behind or beyond this flux. The Yogacara branch of this school holds that because there are no minds, there is no one to see the truth and no way to discover it. Given the lack of substances, which would include minds, all that exist are mental states. Our lack of control over perception or the apparent objectivity of things is merely the effect of our own memories. It should be evident at this point that Buddhism has grappled with the same kinds of questions about what really exists as those that have held the attention of Western philosophers throughout history. One difference is that, with the exception of ancient Stoicism and Epicureanism, and perhaps contemporary Buddhism, Western philosophers do not have life practices directly linked to their intellectual beliefs. Useful sources for philosophical comparison include Masayo Abe and Stephen Hine, Zen, and Comparative Studies. 1997, Dan Lusthaus, Buddhist Phenomenology, a philosophical investigation of Yogacara Buddhism. 1997, and Anil Kumar Sarkar, Buddhism and Whitehead's Process Philosophy, 1991.
What is the problem of universals?
The problem of universals, as addressed by Boethius, 480 c. 525, has to do with what makes a kind of thing distinct from other things. Take, for example, the domestic dog. Dogs have the greatest genetic variety of any living species. Scientists can now identify every one of them as dogs, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. In principle, that is, they don't actually do this, by their DNA, which has certain predetermined resemblances to earlier lines of canines. However, well before the discovery of genes and DNA, human beings could both identify any particular animal that was a dog as a dog, even though that dog had a unique appearance and personality. What is true of dogs in this sense is true of all natural species. All of their members seem to share something. Plato would have said that a dog's essence is a copy of an ideal form of dog, in which all dogs participate. Aristotle would have said that there is an essence of dogness, which can be known to human beings and which is shared by all dogs, but that the dog essence is in each dog and only abstracted by the mind. Strictly speaking, for Aristotle there does not exist a dog essence apart from Rover, Jake, Lacey, Mirabelle, or any other name that designates a unique animal. The problem of universals is the question of whether Plato or Aristotle was correct. Philosophers have agonized over this question and burnt many candles, oil lamps, and computers in the process. Those who think that the essences in individual things are real have been called realists. Those who think that essences are abstractions or creations of the human mind have been called nominalists.
Who is Julia Kristeva?
Since arriving in France in 1966 from Bulgaria, Julia Kristeva, 1941, has achieved international recognition for her writings about women in the psychoanalytic tradition. Her work is considered multidisciplinary, encompassing art criticism, philosophy, and cultural critique. Kristeva's primary theoretical contribution has been a distinction between the symbolic aspects of language and what she calls the semiotic, a psychic level of meaning based on a child's relationship to its mother. Primary human desires are attached to the semiotic, which is based on the biological rhythms of the maternal body. Although the semiotic eludes symbolic translation,
What is feminist reclamation?
in philosophy, as well as other fields, feminist reclamation has been the rediscovery of women thinkers who have been neglected in traditional intellectual history, especially before the 1980s. Some of these women are considered philosophers only if philosophy is broadly construed, but others worked comprehensively on issues central to their field, influenced their peers, and have only recently been fully recognized for their achievements. A strong example of this category is Ruth Barkin Marcus.
What are the main themes and influences in philosophy of technology?
Most of the writing is on the progressive/environmentalist/feminist/postmodern side of contemporary philosophy. While not anti-technology per se, there is a deep suspicion of technology as a force in its own right that stems from Martin Heidegger's 1889 to 1976, The Question Concerning Technology. By contrast, more optimistic views of technology stem from the writings of John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Key issues are, whether technology can be controlled independently of radical economic and political changes, whether technology can correct its own excesses, and the roles played by technology in the history of science. Contemporary books of interest include, Michael Adass, Machines as the Measure of Men. Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, 1990, Eric Higgs Anthology Technology and the Good Life. 2000, and Hans Achterhuis, American Philosophy of Technology, 2001.
Who was William Whewell?
William Whewell, 1794 to 1866, was a polymath who contributed work to mechanics, mineralogy, geology, astronomy, political economy, theology, education, law, architecture, ethics, the philosophy of science, and what he named ideology. He was a founder and president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and a Fellow of the Royal Society. Whewell invented the term scientist analogously with artist. He was the most influential figure in British education in the 19th century.
What happened in Athens after both Plato and Aristotle were gone?
Athens remained the center of philosophy until the Romans sacked it in 87 BCE. Much of our knowledge of Hellenistic philosophical activity comes from the 1st century BCE Roman writers Lucretius, 99 to 55 BCE, and Cicero, 106 to 43 BCE, and secondary medieval sources. Plato's Academy became the new academy, which was devoted to critical work on the thought of other schools. This was the beginning of the skeptics. Aristotle's Lyceum, or the Peripatos, was first led by Theophrastus in 322 BCE. But after 287 BCE, it fell into decline until the middle of the 1st century BCE.
Why was Pyrrho important?
His refusal to make judgments was an important school of skepticism that was developed after the Renaissance and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, known as Pyrrhonic skepticism. It was the general philosophical approach that many things in human life cannot be known.
What are Afrocentrism and the African diaspora?
In the United States, Afrocentrism begins with the premise that American slaves end through intergenerational cultural inheritance, if not a now untenable biological essentialism. Their descendants came from Africa. At the time when the original slave populations were kidnapped from Africa, Africa had fully developed religions, cultures, cities, and civilizations dating before ancient Western philosophy. The involuntary implantations of Africans as slaves in the Americas and Europe resulted in a forced scattering, or diaspora, from those African origins. The reclamation of their African heritage on the part of African Americans results in a different perspective than the dominant white view that African slaves were forced immigrants without original cultures comparable to the cultures of those who enslaved them. Afrocentrism is thus a foundation for a new African American pride, in both origins and contemporary identity. Through cultural inheritance, for all groups and their members who are part of the African diaspora. A new legitimate foundation of culture, complete with its own art, architecture, poetry, styles of clothing, food, and everyday habits, is therefore claimed. It needs to be emphasized that this is in contrast to the culture of slave cabins, slave field labor, or slave service in the homes of masters, complete with the loss of original names, on through the oppressively degrading conditions of segregation, disproportionate incarceration, ghetto living conditions, the destruction of traditional black nuclear families and neighborhoods, and a general sense of being both the cause and object of America's unique race problem. Afrocentrism is thereby a perspective of encouragement and racial uplift. Sources on Afrocentrism include Martin Bernal's Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, 3 volumes, 1987-2006, Lewis R. Gordon's Her Majesty's Other Children, Sketches of Racism from a Neocolonial Age, 1997, and Molefi Asante's The Afrocentric Idea, 1987.
Did early Neoplatonism include women philosophers?
Yes. Overall, Christianity emphasized the importance of the individual immortal soul. And although the church was run by men and its dominant theologians were male, the religious lives and work of women had a recognized place in schools and convents. This change was first evident in the Neoplatonist movement.
Who was George Herbert Mead?
George Herbert Mead, 1863–1931, was a philosopher, social theorist, and reformer whom John Dewey, 1859–1952, described as a seminal mind of the first order. Dewey brought him to the University of Chicago when he accepted his position there. Mead had been raised in a New England Puritan community, but in his mature thought he became an empiricist. Mead's most important contribution to both pragmatic theories of education and sociology was his idea of symbolic interaction. He offered an explanation of the development of the human mind and self through the development of language and role-playing. Although something of a behaviorist in his insistence on the social nature of individual mental development, Mead also believed that there were different developmental stages of adjustment to the external environment. Mead worked with Dewey in the Chicago Laboratory School and was a friend of Jane Addams. 1860 to 1935, and a close observer of her work at Hull House.
What does the Lock-Nozick solution leave out?
It doesn't account for how we can come to own both the parts of something we have mixed our labor with and the parts we haven't. How is it possible that in owning property which first became a commodity, because someone improved it, one comes to own the mineral rights to that property? Also, how do we decide when something is too big to mix our labor with, so that we cannot, as in Nozick's ocean example, come to own all of it?
Why is philosophy important?
Philosophical study of the natural world gave rise to the physical sciences of our day. Physics, astronomy, geology, biology, and chemistry. Although other cultures, for example, China, have had distinctive sciences and technology, Western technology, as a product of Western science, has had global predominance in the modern period. Philosophical study of the human world gave rise to the social sciences of psychology, history, political science, sociology, and anthropology, as well as linguistics and cognitive science. Of course, many theoretical ideas about the world remain in philosophy as metaphysics, and many human questions are still only considered in philosophy, insofar as it is part of the humanities. These human questions are of universal interest across cultures and in ordinary, practical, daily life.
Who was Otto Neurath?
Otto Neurath, 1882 to 1945, was a polymath who had begun by studying mathematics in Vienna, earning a doctorate in the subject in Berlin. During World War I he was assigned to the planning ministry by the Austrian government because he had earlier written about barter economies. The Marxist governments of Bavaria and Saxony hired him to implement their post-war socialist economies. He was charged with treason when the German government took over, although he was soon released. In graphic design, he contributed to the Viennese Social and Economic Museum with his invention of isotype, a system of symbols for iconographically presenting quantitative information to the public. As a logical positivist, Neurath was the main architect of the Manifesto of the Vienna Circle. Along with Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, John Dewey, 1859–1952, and others. He advocated the Unity of Science project, which was to result in the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science that would unify language and method and interdisciplinary dialogue across the sciences. It was never published. Neurath's ambition was to render the social sciences as predictive as the physical sciences. His main works include Through War Economy to Economy in Kind, 1919, Personal Life and Class Struggle. 1928, Empirical Sociology, 1931, and Neurath-Carnap Correspondence, 1943–1945. As well as numerous articles in edited collections, as well as work on the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. Neurath was married 3 times and his last wife, Marie, carried on his isotype work after his death.
Who were the natural philosophers?
Natural philosophy was the term used to describe what we now call science. The key players in the scientific revolution, beginning with Galileo, 1564–1642, and ending with Isaac Newton, 1643–1727. Were called natural philosophers and were revered as geniuses by philosophers of their day. The lines between scientific inquiry, philosophical theories of knowledge, and philosophy of science were not clearly drawn until these natural philosophers' discoveries and theories helped define them.
Quine on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
In 1957 Putnam published the article The Analytic and the Synthetic. In the anthology Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science, edited by H. Fagel and G. Maxwell, 1962, in which he showed how the history of the definitions of kinetic energy made it impossible to divide statements about kinetic energy into analytic and empirical, or synthetic ones.
How did Hume proceed philosophically to create his science of the mind?
Hume formulated and applied, over a large range of subjects, 2 main principles. First, all of our knowledge is the result of either sense impressions or reflections on the workings of our own mind. Second, no matter of fact can be proved a priori, or before experience. As Hume put it, all the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into 2 distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. He held that the sciences of the natural world and beliefs about human society are the result of empirical investigation. The truths of mathematics and logic are known without investigating the world. For this reason, they are not about the world, but about the workings of human minds. Our sensory information, which gives us immediate factual knowledge, is more compelling than our ideas. As Hume stated, the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. Hume had no use for past philosophical projects that contained a priori speculation about the workings of this world or the next. Here is how he summed up this doctrine, if we take into our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics. For instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Consign it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
What did Zarathustra say in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra?
In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883–1885, Nietzsche presents the thoughts of his eponymous hero, who is named after the prophet who founded the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra's goal, presented in a series of aphorisms, is to prepare for the coming of the Übermensch, or Overman, who will fill the vacuum left by the death of the Christian God and the absence of real human heroes. Human life will be created as artists create their works.
Is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative different from the Golden Rule?
Yes, it is. According to the Golden Rule, we should act as we would have others act toward us. If our tastes are perverted or we do not care for our own welfare, the Golden Rule could permit acts of depravity and violence, but such acts could never be willed categorically. Moreover, Kant's system is strongly based on individual good, will toward the community of all other rational individuals. There is a debt to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, 1712–1778, idea of the common good here. Indeed, Kant greatly respected Rousseau's moral philosophy.
What is anarchism?
Anarchism is a theory and political movement that is based on ideals of freedom and equality. All forms of domination, authority, and subordination are considered unjust and backed up by force. The state and all of its supporting institutions, as well as the institutions supported by the state, are deemed unacceptable. Society should be reorganized into small, self-governing communities in which members cooperate toward the same ends and produce their livelihood together. English journalist and political philosopher William Godwin, 1756–1836, initiated modern anarchism in the 18th century. And in the 19th, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809–1865. Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin, 1814–1876, and Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin, 1842–1921, were leading figures.
What was c. I. Lewis' form of pragmatism?
Lewis believed that all knowledge about the world, even simple perceptual truths, is hypothetical, taking the form of if I do X, then Y will result. For example, to say that the wall is hard means that I will have a certain sensation if I bang my head against it, just as the claim that the peach is ripe means that if I bite into it, I will experience certain expected flavors. In ethics, Lewis believed that value judgments are appraisals of the consequences of action. Aesthetic valuation, however, involves an apprehension of an objective qualitative mode of experience. Lewis, like John Dewey, 1859–1952, believed that values are in the world as objective qualities, and not the result of human preferences or judgments. According to Lewis, every experience has both a value dimension, according to where it is on a scale from good to bad, and an aesthetic dimension from pleasing to unpleasant, or of high to low aesthetic quality. In both ethics and aesthetics, some things can be seen to be intrinsically good, upon reflection. And in ethics, the aim and purpose of action is often what is intrinsically good.
What is Pierre-Simon Laplace's theory of probability?
The fact that we do not know certain things gives rise to the idea of probabilities. Because we view the world as determined in assuming that every event has a cause. The probability of an event depends on a combination of what we do know and what we do not know. Laplace's theory of probability was that if there is no reason to believe that one of a number of events n will occur, then the probability of each happening is 1/n. For example, the probability that any day of the week chosen at random will be either a Tuesday or a Thursday is 2/7.
What was Bentham's main proposal for prison reform?
In his Panopticon letters, Jeremy Bentham proposed a new type of prison building so that every prisoner would be under continual observation. He drew elaborate blueprints for this kind of building, which would regulate every aspect of the lives of prisoners. It was intended as a humane but highly effective method for controlling the minds of prisoners.
Why did philosophers love Maimonides?
Maimonides, 1135–1204, provided a justification for philosophical thought in a religious context at a time when philosophers feared persecution from religious authorities. the problems Maimonides raised in reconciling Aristotelian philosophy or the best conclusions of reason at that time with religion brought into religion itself philosophical problems about the limits of knowledge and what ought to be concluded when reason has run out.
How did the Church react to Galileo's theories?
In an act that remains famous to this day, the Inquisition ordered Galileo, 1564-1642, to recant his theories and placed him under house arrest during the last decade of his life. Before that time, however, Cardinal Bellarmine tried for years to persuade Galileo to accept a compromise. The Church did not object to the Copernican theory so long as it was not claimed to be a description of what was true. The Cardinal told a friend of Galileo's that it would be acceptable if he claimed that the Copernican theory did no more than save the appearances, that is, provide a hypothesis from which astronomical observations could be logically deduced without claiming that Earth actually moved. Galileo was, in the end, forced to do exactly that. Although at the outset he refused to deny the truth of the Copernican theory as a true astronomical description.
How did Peter Lombard answer his question of whether God was the cause of evil and sin?
God is of course good and has a good nature. Out of this good nature, God created an angel. This angel became evil after God created him and passed his evil on to man. Evil in man resulted in sin. God was therefore not the first cause of either human evil or sin. Lombard's explanation is similar to how we would explain how a good parent has a bad child at some point. The creation or offspring is morally responsible for itself, and Lombard located that point originally in an angel. Lombard, c. 1095-1160, wrote about this and other issues in his 4-volume Book of Sentences. 1145-1151, that soon became a standard text for theological training that was in use until the mid-1200s. Others would begin with his work and then develop their own ideas on its basis.
What were Bentham's life and career like?
Bentham was born in Houndsditch, London, and began studies at Queen's College, Oxford, when he was just 12 years old. After his graduation, he entered Lincoln's Inn to become a lawyer and was called to the bar in 1767. He never practiced law, though, instead dedicating himself to reforming the entire system of civil and criminal law. Existing legal theory seemed incoherent, he felt, and the penal system was cruel and very expensive to administrate. Bentham's legal writings began with work on legal reform that was not published until 1811. And his comment on Blackstone's commentaries was not published until 1928. Bentham wrote voluminously. but there was a certain disorganization in his methods of completing any one thing. He published part of his Blackstone criticism as a fragment on government. 1776, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. Bentham attempted to gain Catherine the Great of Russia's support for his constitutional code. He was made a citizen of France after the Revolution. In 1792, and his ideas also reached the United States. But he was most influential politically in England, where he was leader of the philosophical radicals and an inspiration to the Benthamites. Both of these groups thought that Bentham's pleasure principle or principle of utility could be used to change the world for the better. James Mill, father of John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. The great 19th-century English utilitarian, was a close friend of his. Bentham also founded the journal Westminster Review, as well as University College.
What did Hume have to say about the self?
Hume famously denied any evidence for the existence of a self as a substance or soul. He wrote, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." He went on to explain that what a person calls his or her self is no more than a bundle or bundles of perceptions, no one of which is a direct idea of a self-thing.
Who was Leo Strauss?
Leo Strauss, 1899 to 1973, is important for his work relating philosophical texts to politics in real life. He was a German-born American philosopher who left a position at the Academy of Jewish Research in Berlin, Germany, to study in Paris, France, on a Rockefeller Fellowship in 1932. Because, as a Jew, it was unsafe for him to return to Germany when the Nazis came to power. He taught at Cambridge University and in New York, until he became professor of political science at the University of Chicago in 1949. Remaining there until 1969. Strauss taught classical political philosophy. His work became inspirational to American neoconservatives after his death. His students and purported followers in real-world politics during the administration of President George W. Bush included Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and Abram Schulsky, who headed the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans. The political writer William Crystal was also a student. But so were the liberal social critic Susan Sontag and the apolitical literary critic Alan Bloom. Strauss' principal publications include The Political Philosophy of Hobbes, 1935, reprinted, 1952, Persecution and the Art of Writing, 1952, Natural Right and History. 1953, Thoughts on Machiavelli, 1958, The City and Man, 1964. Political Philosophy, 6 essays by Leo Strauss, 1975, and Socrates and Aristophanes, 1980.
Who was Jacques Derrida?
The Algerian-born French intellectual theorist, Jacques Derrida, 1930–2004. Is widely considered to be the founder of deconstructionism, which he presented in his introduction to a 1962 translation of Edmund Husserl's, 1859–1938, The Origin of Geometry. In a later interview, Derrida said of this work, using his distinctive terminology that has made so many Anglo-American philosophers dismissive of deconstruction, in this essay the problematic of writing was already in place as such. Bound to the irreducible structure of deferral in its relationships to consciousness. Presence, science, history, and the history of science, the disappearance or delay of the origin, etc. This essay can be read as the other side, recto or verso, as you wish, of speech and phenomena. Using Husserl's standard that for something to be known it must be known by human consciousness. Derrida developed a critique of the metaphysics of presence. The tradition that imagined knowledge as a thing known to God or the absolute consciousness. He called the whole history of Western philosophy a search for a transcendental being that serves as the origin or guarantor of meaning. His principal books include Speech and Phenomena and other essays on Husserl's theory of signs. 1973, Of Grammatology, 1976, Writing and Difference, 1978, Spurs, Nietzsche Styles, 1979. The Archaeology of the Frivolous, Reading Kondelik, 1980, Margins of Philosophy, 1982. The Postcard, From Socrates to Freud and Beyond, 1987, Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry. An Introduction, 1962, 1989, Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question, 1989, and The Gift of Death, 1995. Derrida is most famous for Of Grammatology, 1972.
How did the Islamic religion begin?
The Prophet Muhammad, 570–632, who was born in Saudi Arabia and died in Medina, was the founder of Islam. At the age of 40, he experienced an epiphany in which the angel Gabriel appeared to him while he was meditating. Until he was 60, he experienced continuing revelations that identified him as the culmination of a tradition of prophets from Abraham in the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, down to Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament. His transcription of his revelations were the basis of the Quran, or Quran, the Bible of Islam. Muhammad had a divine mandate to spread the new religion. Within the first 100 years of Islam, jihad, or holy war, reached into France, where Charles the Sledgehammer defeated the Muslims at Tours. In Spain, the Moors built luscious gardens and beautiful buildings, chief among which were the magnificent libraries in Córdoba, Granada, Seville, and Toledo. The Muslim cultural influence is still evident in Spanish architecture to this day.
What are some details of David Hume's life and career?
Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711. His father was a distant relative of the Earl of Home, and his mother's close relatives were lawyers. David was expected to study law, but he didn't like it and left Edinburgh University when he was 15 to read and think about philosophy. He subjected himself to years of intense study, and in 1734 was under a doctor's care for ailments of body and spirit. This was followed by a philosophical breakthrough, as well as work for a merchant in Bristol. He then spent 3 years at La Flèche, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, Old School. Hume anonymously published a treatise of human nature in 1739. This work was ignored by other intellectuals, and Hume himself later described it as having fallen stillborn from the press. In hopes of greater recognition, Hume was consumed by what he called love of literary fame. He composed an abstract of a treatise of human nature, which was anonymously published in 1740. His next major philosophical work was Philosophical Essays Concerning the Human Understanding, 1748, which was retitled An Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, 1758. Then came An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, 1751. The inquiry was more explicitly anti-religious than the treatise. His Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was probably written during the 1750s. Although published posthumously. With his philosophical research complete, Hume applied himself to history. His History of Great Britain won him great fame and acclaim, economics, ethics, and political philosophy. However, he also tried, although without success, to secure the position of Chair of Philosophy at the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. He was appointed Secretary to General St. Clair for 3 years in 1746, which led him to Brittany and Turin. And he was in charge of the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh for 5 years. Beginning in 1752. He was then private secretary to the British ambassador in Paris and Under Secretary of State.
How did Peter Kropotkin come to form his life philosophy?
Kropotkin's father was a general, and Kropotkin was educated in the Corps of Pages. Becoming an attendant to Tsar Alexander II, He received a commission in the mounted Cossacks of the Amur and went to Siberia, where he investigated the penal system. What he saw turned him against the repressive form of government in place. In his 20s, Kropotkin led expeditions into unchanged arid areas of Siberia, which resulted in discoveries about glaciation, the deserts of Eastern Asia, and mountain structure. He read Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's, 1809–1865, writings, which led him to resign his commission in protest of an execution of Polish prisoners, who had attempted to escape. After exploring the eskers of Finland, he was offered the position of Secretary of the Russian Geological Society in 1872. But instead went to Switzerland to meet exiled radicals. Kropotkin decided he was an anarchist after moving interactions with Bakunin's followers among the watchmakers of Jura. The watchmakers were conscientious craftsmen who were not part of the wider industrial revolution, and their cooperation in a close-knit community inspired Kropotkin. When he returned to Russia, he joined the underground, and in 1874 was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress. He escaped to Europe, where he founded the journal Le Revolt in 1879 and participated in the London International Anarchist Congress in 1881. In Lyons, France, in 1882, he was sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment for being a member of the International Workingmen's Association, but public outcry led to an early release. After that, he went to England and remained there, returning to Russia after the Russian Revolution of 1917. When Kropotkin lived in England, he worked mainly as a scholar. Leading scientific journals and publishers printed his work. His most important publications were Memoirs of a Revolutionist, 1899, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, 1902, and Modern Science and Anarchism, 1912. His last work, Ethics, was published in 1924 after he died in Russia. Kropotkin's final years were disappointing to him because the aftermath of the Russian Revolution defied his anarchist ideals. He denounced the Bolshevik reign of terror after the October Revolution.
What is Noam Chomsky's own theory of language?
While Chomsky has developed different versions of his theories over the years, often abandoning his own followers of previous versions, most commentators agree that overall themes and trends in his thought amount to the claim that linguistic ability or language in a general syntactic or grammatical sense is hardwired into the human brain as a physical structure enabling a linguistic faculty. Chomsky has posited a universal grammar that limits the group of possible human languages. In philosophical terms, this is a rationalist, rather than an empiricist, approach to language. Thus, in Cartesian Linguistics, 1966, Chomsky clearly stated, in affinity with René Descartes, 1596–1650, that human language is innate and that human beings universally share this capacity. It should be noted, however, that Chomsky is a materialist concerning mental activity. Whereas Descartes believed that the mind was a non-material substance.
How is environmentalism related to racial and international studies?
Theorists of racial discrimination such as Laura Westra and Bill E. Lawson have identified environmental racisms. Minorities, who live in poor neighborhoods, are more vulnerable to having toxic dump sites in their immediate environments, for example. Some indigenous philosophers have criticized the whole Western technological project. By contrast, international scholars have criticized Western environmentalists for assuming that development in poor countries for the improvement of human life is less important than the preservation of nature.
Who was Herbert Marcuse?
Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, generally inspired left-wing thought in the United States after he was exiled from Germany in 1933. He was, for example, African-American political activist Angela Davis' dissertation advisor. And Abbie Hoffman, one of the radical founders of the New Left, studied with him as well. Marcuse's primary theme was that philosophy is necessary to combat political oppression. He drew on Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, and Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. To criticize Marxism for its underlying Enlightenment faith in reason. He thought that Western democracies, as well as communist regimes, used scientific methods to deprive people of freedom through mass education and the trivialization of culture into entertainment. His major theme was the ways in which political repression was mirrored in psychosexual repression. His main works include Reason and Revolution, 1941, Eros and Civilization, 1955, One-Dimensional Man, 1964, and Critique of Pure Tolerance, 1969.
How did Ralph Waldo Emerson define transcendentalism?
He considered transcendentalism a kind of philosophical idealism that held that the ultimate reality was spiritual and not material. He thought that experience was limited in telling us what things are in themselves or what to value. Emerson also referred to a Kantian notion of ideas or imperative forms, which made experience possible, and he ascribed to Immanuel Kant. 1724 to 1804, the label transcendental forms, for these realities of the mind and spirit.
Who was Plotinus?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, was born in Upper Egypt. At the age of 28, he began an 11-year study of philosophy with Ammonius Saccas. Nd. He left to fight with Emperor Gordianus Iis, Marcus Antonius Gordianus Pius. Also known as Gordian III, 225 to 244, army against Persia. After Gordianus died, or according to some accounts was murdered, Plotinus fled to Antioch, but then settled in Rome. He founded a school in Rome, became friends with Emperor Gallienus, Publius Licinius Egnatius Gallienus, c. 218 to 268, and began writing down his philosophy. Gallienus intended to give Plotinus land to set up a community in accordance with Plato's dialogue. The laws, c. 360 BCE, but others intervened. And Gallienus was soon assassinated by his own officers in the midst of a competitive military campaign. Plotinus himself died 2 years later, it is said, from leprosy.
How did medicine progress after Hippocrates?
Galen of Pergamum, c. 129 c. 216 CE, preserved Hippocratic medicine, which continued largely unchanged through the Renaissance. Galen was able to increase knowledge of physiology by dissecting pigs and apes. Since human dissection was against Roman law, he learned how to treat trauma and wounds while working as a physician in a gladiator school. Galen performed many operations, including brain and eye surgery. The removal of cataracts, which were not attempted again for almost 2,000 years. He eventually became a physician to Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 180 CE. In the 9th century, Galen's writings were translated into Arabic by Hunan ibn Ishaq, 809 to 873. However, the Arabs rarely practiced surgery, and among Christians, the knowledge and practice of surgery had already been abolished. Galen remains so highly regarded that when dissections during the Renaissance appeared to contradict his descriptions, they were considered anomalous. His prescription of bloodletting for almost every illness was followed as late as the 19th century.
Who was Maurice Merleau-Ponty?
Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908 to 1961. Was an anti-empiricist who sought to reconstruct the world based on a phenomenology of human perception. He was influenced by Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938, was friends with Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, for a while, and continues to be of great interest to phenomenological philosophers of mind. His principal works are The Phenomenology of Perception, 1945. Numerous essays, and his unfinished The Visible and the Invisible.
Why were the Sophists important philosophically?
The Sophists do not have an august reputation, and their successors in ancient times, particularly Plato, had little praise for their contributions to philosophy. However, that assessment may not be altogether fair. Unlike the pre-Socratics, who concentrated on the natural, non-human world, the Sophists were interested in human nature and human affairs. The Sophists were the first humanists in Western philosophy. We should also keep in mind that much of their thought was opposed to the timeless wisdom prized by Plato. And much of how they were characterized comes from Plato. The Sophists were public intellectuals who popularized existing knowledge and wisdom, with some original modification. The subjects they addressed included grammar, theory of language, ethics, political philosophy and doctrines, religion, ideas about the gods, human nature, and the origins of humankind, literary criticism, mathematics, and last but not least, speculations about the natural world that had been developed by the pre-Socratics.
Why are Immanuel Kant's epistemology and metaphysics transcendental?
To this day, philosophers dispute whether Kant was providing a theory of how the mind in fact works or instead a critical theory of how we ought to view knowledge. In either case, Kant's epistemology and metaphysics are both transcendental. His epistemology is transcendental in that he reasons a priori from what is known to what must be the case in order to account for what is known. And his metaphysics is transcendental in that what ultimately exists exceeds and eludes both our direct knowledge and full understanding. Even though we are justified in postulating it according to certain principles of reason.